welcome everyone to this morning's one of this morning's breakout sessions. My name is Lisa Cruz. I'm the Vice President for Communications at Texas Biomedical Research Institute, and I will be moderating our panel session today. The session that we're going to be, or the topic we'll be talking about is pandemics and conspiracies, why STEM and public health education matter. So, of course, as a as a communications professional, this topic definitely piqued my interest as someone who essentially makes sure that we're trying to constantly communicate accurate information. Conspiracies are definitely flawed information. And so that was one of the reasons I was very excited to be asked to moderate this panel session. And joining me is Dr. Joanne Turner. She is the Executive Vice President for Research at Texas Biomed. In addition to her administrative role, she manages a research program. She also runs our regulatory operations and also oversees our department, educational research department, and is very keen on outreach and education with the community and participates quite often in our outreach. Also with us here in the room is Adam Hamilton. He is President and CEO of Southwest Research Institute. Adam holds a Master's of Science in Aerospace Engineering and Engineering Mechanics from UT Austin. He is also a certified professional engineer in Texas, and his multidisciplinary technical expertise includes engineering, science, and risk assessment. Adam also has what I'd like to call a side gig hobby in studying infectious diseases and looking into specifically smallpox. So we'll get to hear a little bit more about that from Adam a little bit later. And then I believe joining us on screen, joining us virtually, is Dr. Ian Cheeseman, Associate Professor at Texas Biomed. Dr. Cheeseman's lab focuses on the genetics of malaria parasites and other eukaryotic pathogens. He also participates very heavily in our outreach and education program, and is very passionate about sharing science with the community. So welcome, Dr. Cheeseman. Thank you for joining us. So I wanted to kick... Absolutely. So I wanted to kick off this session by giving everybody in the room, since I can't see those of you virtually, but everybody in the room, a little bit of a pop quiz. And so I want to start by asking just a couple of questions on who believes these. And you can choose whether or not you want to admit that you believe them. But the first statement is global warming is a hoax. All right, I don't see any hands raised. The Earth is really flat. Still no hands. The moon landing was faked. All right. Vaccines cause autism. This last one might actually get a few of you. Aliens really do exist. Yeah. All right, so there are a few of us that raised our hands to that last one. According to a January 2022 article in Newsweek, these are the top 5 scientific conspiracy theories that still exist today, even though most of these have been debunked. That last one, while it hasn't been proven true, it hasn't been proven untrue. So those are the top 5 conspiracy theories. There is a political science professor named Eric Oliver, and in one of his podcasts, he states that what we see when we see people engaged in conspiracy theories is that they're drawing on their own intuitions to make sense of the world. So it's actually not rational thought, it is intuitional thought that is driving their belief system in conspiracy theories. So one could argue that how information makes a person feel, whether it confirms or denies a fear, for example, plays a large part in information's believability. So we have scientists on our panel. They work in a world of data rationality. When we're faced with a world of intuitionists, we obviously need to know how we figure out how to approach these conversations, right? How can we be a bit more meaningful and empathetic with people who are approaching the conversation from a different frame of mind. So I wanted to frame that, our conversation in that context, because we're going to come back to that at the end with some of our questions. But I want to first start with actually one of the more famous conspiracies, really, of our generation, which is the conspiracy theory around vaccines causing autism. And I know, Dr. Turner, you have actually taught a class on this very particular topic. And so can you explain to us, how this theory got started, how it spread, and really why it continues?
Yeah, see if I can be heard. Are we good? Yes, excellent. So thank you for inviting me to this panel. I have taught a class on vaccines and autism back in a few years ago. And even in a class full of graduate students, there was a really mixed response to some of that class. Really, to talk about history, we're talking about something that happened over 2 decades ago. And there was a publication that came out in the late 90s from Dr. Andrew Wakefield. And it was in The Lancet, and The Lancet's a pretty prestigious journal, medical journal. And he presented data from a study he'd done looking at 12 children that he'd recruited into a study. And really what he was looking at in that paper was whether there was a link between gut-associated illness and behavioral disorders. So the vaccine wasn't in this paper initially. He actually set out to just ask whether children that had developmental disorders or regressive development disorders had problems with their GI tract. And that was something that had been very well known for many years prior to that. Back in the 60s, that link had been made. And part of that study, he asked the parents about things that had happened when they saw changes in their child's development. And many of them talked about the MMR vaccine. And so that went into the narrative of his manuscript, really stating that some of the children had an adverse reaction to the vaccine. And then it was linked sometimes spatially, but not immediately, with changes in that child's developmental behaviors. They did not, in that paper, ever state that they believed there was a link. They made it very clear in their discussion that they found no association with the MMR vaccine and autism. They did speculate on it. So that was really the paper. It was a very small note. It was 12 children. It did not say that vaccines cause autism. But what happened after that was really what led to this movement that we often now call the anti-vax movement, or vaccine hesitancy. And it really came from how Dr. Wakefield engaged with the media and with the public. He was asked to be on a lot of media shows, asked to talk to a lot of media. And it really was something that when we come to intuition and people's experiences, for parents that had a child that had developmental disorders, it's something that made sense to them. And so he used that to continue engaging with the public and driving this narrative that the MMR vaccine in particular caused autism. And the media fed that. It came out and it was online. Obviously, everything's electronic now, and it's continued to drive that movement of anti-vaccine. But it wasn't something that he initially said, but he did continue that rhetoric and that dialogue over time, and still to this day would continue that conversation. So this was where the public grasped onto something that made sense. Parents were really trying to understand why their children had developmental challenges. And then they landed on something that a doctor was telling them could be linked, and they believed it. Now, that paper's retracted, and I think this is really important when we talk about how we communicate science. The paper was retracted, and we don't retract scientific papers quickly. They're done through a really robust study to ask whether the study was done correctly. And in this case, there were challenges with the study. First, it was a very small group size, and any finding in science, you need to have the right number of study subjects to believe and to see that causation and see that link. And 12 children really wasn't enough. There was a little bit of selection bias in how those children came into the study, which probably skewed the study to be in favor of his findings. And then later on, we did find out he had some financial investment in an alternate outcome because he had financial investment in other vaccines that could substitute the MMR. So lots of reasons why that was retracted. You can still find it online, but most people don't go and find the retraction. They'll go and look at the original paper. The other thing that happened after that was that it was disproved, and it was disproved through really rigorous science. Replication is really the friend of robust science. If I have a finding in the lab, I have to show I can find it again. It's even stronger finding if somebody in another city or another country finds the same finding. And it's really robust if that finding is through thousands and thousands of studies, or thousands and thousands of people in a study. And so because of the Wakefield paper, a lot of research funding was put into disproving that finding. A lot of money, a lot of taxpayers' money, funded science to show that it absolutely was not true. There is no connection. What also happened was that that money that went into disproving something that hadn't really been shown using robust science prevented us studying other things. We could have had vaccines. Maybe we could have a vaccine for HIV if we'd put that money elsewhere instead of the millions and millions of dollars and funds all around the world that actually went into proving over and over again that this finding wasn't real. And what we didn't have was the media attention to the retraction and the media attention to disproving what was originally stated in that paper. And that, I think, is a real loss for us. And so the media gave attention to something that seemed really exciting and a solution, but they did not come back and dial back that comment and tell the public that actually maybe we should be skeptical about this and think about it another way. We have many studies now that show lots of really promising links to why children develop autism, and it really isn't linked to the Andrew Wakefield study.
So I have a question for, actually, I'm going to open this up to all of you. Related to that is whether or not, thank you. So I have a question related to your comments in terms of whether or not really this quickness, the speed to distrust vaccines based on essentially a single paper, if that distrust is the same worldwide. All three of you have worked in around the world in other places, but really is distrust in vaccines sort of something we can do out of privilege here in the U.S.? And so I'm just opening up that question to all of you.
I'm happy to answer it.
Please do.
I keep looking up at Ian, his giant head.
Ian, if you want to start.
Yeah, do you want to start, Ian?
I can jump in. Yeah. So absolutely, there is not universal distrust of vaccines throughout the world. Certainly throughout a lot of parts in Africa where we work, people will queue up to get vaccines. People will be ensuring that their children get every possible opportunity. And the same vaccine hesitancy is not present there at all. So we certainly have not seen it there. And I think even sort of within other countries that have widespread availability to vaccines as well, this same level of distrust has not necessarily been sown as well. I believe in the UK it is far less controversial to vaccinate your children than it is here in the US. It is much less of a talking point, for instance.
If I could add, I think we have a privilege of forgetting what many of these infections do to us. You only have to go back a couple of generations, and you will find people who had polio, who have disabilities from polio. When polio first was really a problem in the US, parents were lining up their children to be vaccinated because the alternate was so much worse for their children. My mother will tell stories about her friends at school who had measles or mumps and became deaf or have ongoing neurological disabilities, and her friends, and this is really only going back one generation from me. I'm fortunate that I don't experience that in my everyday. And so we become a little bit complacent. And if we saw the diseases firsthand that impact our friends and our family and our community, I think we would probably embrace vaccination a little quicker. We're not surrounded by the devastation of TB, HIV, malaria, hepatitis, polio, diphtheria. The lists go on and on and on in countries that maybe are less well-resourced. And so we're really fortunate not to see it. But by not seeing it, we've forgotten what vaccines do and how they've allowed us to actually have such a privileged life. And so that would be my take on that.
It's a great insight. I don't know that this, okay. Thank you for that insight. And that actually leads me to my question for Adam. Really, distrust of vaccines is actually the height, I guess the extent to which people distrust them today might have been heightened by that paper, but historically there's actually been historical significance to this distrust. So explain a little bit more about your research in smallpox and what you've learned there.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And I didn't know that question was coming, but I do have a few slides prepared. Can you get this? Is that good now? Okay, I got you now. Okay, so Ian, I'm sorry, but we're going to say goodbye to you for just a minute. And I'd like to talk about smallpox. Now, Lisa gave away a big secret, and that is I'm an engineer, but for 30 years I've studied smallpox as a hobby. My wife says, I don't ask too many things of you, but please don't tell people you study smallpox as a hobby. But Lisa let the cat out of the bag, so now I am in trouble. But at the top of this slide, what you see are twin brothers. The one on the left is obviously exhibiting signs of smallpox. The one on the right has a very minor case of smallpox. They were exposed at the same event. What do you think the difference is between the brothers? Which one was vaccinated? The one on the right was vaccinated. The one on the left was not. So if you're a parent, what would drive you to say, I don't want my children to be vaccinated? And I'm not saying that those people are necessarily wrong, but it's a different perspective. There may be experiences that they have been through, as we've been talking about, that could inform them in a different way than we would like them to be informed and leads them to make bad decisions. And this goes way back. If I could have the next slide, please. If you don't know, smallpox has been around for a long time. And I'm talking about smallpox, but we'll link it to today and to COVID-19 here in just a minute. This is Ramses V, so one of the earliest victims of smallpox for which we have evidence. But the disease is about 3,500 years old, started in Africa and the Middle East, and it eventually has been around the world. It's a really amazing disease if you look at what happens to the body. And in early days, a lot of this was thought to be related to some kind of omission or commission of something against a deity. And so the diseased people were believed to have had somehow done something wrong. So nobody who did things right thought they could get disease. So one reason that they may not have sought prevention of these diseases. Japan, same thing in the 6th century. They had a smallpox demon. India in the 7th century. Eventually, smallpox was carried throughout Europe. And as the Europeans were fighting quite often, they'd go off to war. And people knew that there were two diseases that soldiers often got. One was syphilis. And in French, it's the grand variole, the big pox. And the other is the smallpox. So there was an association between ways that people might have gotten smallpox. They thought maybe it was in the same way that people got the great pox or syphilis. So therefore there is a stigma associated with it. It's a disease only of those people who do those immoral acts or are not hygienic. If I don't do immoral acts and I'm hygienic, I may not have to worry about being vaccinated. Next slide, please. So the Chinese, they observed that there was, when people had a case of smallpox and survived, that they tended not to get the disease again. So they looked at different ways to introduce the virus that causes smallpox. That virus is called variola, or variola major, more specifically. So the Chinese figured out that if you took that pus, or if you took a scab and dried it up, on the left what you see is they would take dried up smallpox scabs, grind it up, and they would blow it into somebody's nose to intentionally infect them with the variola virus. That process is called variolation, okay? On the right, you'll see here that they also figured out they could create the blistering effect, the pustules, by taking pus from a pustule and planting it in somebody else, basically, and cause the disease. Typically, particularly on the left, that's more dangerous because that's the natural route of entry for smallpox, inhalation. On the right, you're introducing the disease in a way that's not natural for it, and so oftentimes the disease itself can be less severe. So they had some success in inoculating people, stimulating their immune system to produce everything it needs to fight a smallpox infection without having a full-blown case. So the English finally got a hold of it. Lady Montagu was in Turkey, in fact, and she saw this process, and she called it engrafting. Again, keep in mind, this is variolation. So you're taking the smallpox virus and putting it into people intentionally. And the protection was great, but there was the possibility that people, and it did have a pretty high rate of adverse outcomes. People would get a bad case of smallpox and maybe even die. So there was a lot of fear about this process. Why would I put smallpox in my body? And that was brought on by this fact that we're using the virus itself to try to inoculate people against smallpox. But she brought this back, really, she variolated her children, or had them variolated, brought the technology or technique back to the UK, and the physicians, all men, tried to make it better, of course. So they did all kinds of things, fasting and other adjuvants and such, and it didn't work. Lady Montagu kept telling them what to do, and they wouldn't listen to her at the time. So I didn't mean to get off on that track too, but there we go. So next slide, please. So finally, we get to vaccination. I love this. There's another virus, the cowpox virus. Anybody know what that virus is called? Cow, baka, vaccinia. Okay, so the vaccinia virus causes smallpox. You ever heard songs about how beautiful the milkmaids were in England? It's because they had beautiful complexions. They didn't tend to get smallpox. Somebody hypothesized that's because they get something called cowpox when they milk. The teats of the cows would have eruptions or cowpox. The milkmaids would get infected. They would have pox on their hands. And they didn't get smallpox then when exposed. It was kind of folklore and knowledge, but Edward Jenner, a physician, was the first one that really got credit for doing a scientific experiment with this. He took his gardener's son, a guy named James Phipps, who was very young at the time, and he did a trial, as Joanne was talking about. But notice, N equals 1 back in 1796. You could get away with doing it on one person. His milkmaid and his cow Blossom had cowpox. They took some of the pustules and put it in. Mary Nell Thames, his milkmaid, had cowpox. He saw that as an opportunity. He took pus from that cowpox on her hand, and he inoculated his gardener's son. Then he waited about 6 to 8 weeks. He took this kid to a smallpox hospital and intentionally exposed him to smallpox. And the kid didn't get smallpox. So he wrote a paper in 1798, and that was really the first scientific documentation of vaccination, intentionally giving somebody the vaccinia virus. It's a little Trivial Pursuit information there if you'd like it. Next slide, please. But almost immediately we saw hesitancy and resistance. And why is that? Well, because I'm not immoral, because I'm clean, because I don't do those immoral acts. The gods aren't mad at me. And boy, they're going to put that virus or that particle in me that causes smallpox. All that's left over from variolation. Okay, so those same kinds of things created this real fear and conspiracy about the smallpox virus. This is a very famous drawing. I actually have one of the original prints of this by a guy named Gilray. I don't know if you can see it or not, but in the figure here, there's supposed to be Edward Jenner there in the middle, and he is vaccinating a woman. But you see the other people who have already been vaccinated. What's happening to them? They're turning into bovines, right? Various features. People had that kind of fear. That was another fear. We're taking this from an animal and putting it in a human. That kind of fear still exists today, but vaccines are still produced in this way in many parts of the world, and some vaccines are still using that technique. So it really, there's a void of information, and that's what we have to fill with right information, with true information, and not let that void be filled by these rumors and by history and facts. So those old fears are very difficult to assuage. It's hard to get over a lot of that. It took a long time to convince people that variolation uses smallpox, vaccination does not. but there's a lack of trust that can happen. Even now with COVID-19, what we see is a profit motive or benevolence. Same thing during the era of smallpox. Once they started doing vaccination, they were concerned about how the doctors are making money and such. So compulsion and insistence on being vaccinated can have just the opposite of your intended effect. We have to educate and not force people. And entrenchment, once that happens, once we start dividing the groups into the vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, entrenchment is disastrous. We have to prevent that. Okay, there's a whole story behind the slide background here, but I'll save that. They believed if you were vaccinated, you give birth to small cows. Next slide, please. So COVID-19, there's a lot of fears because it was developed so fast. How could they know it's not harmful or dangerous? Because it's developed fast. And people who don't know what mRNA are know that this is an mRNA vaccine and it hasn't been used before. Guidelines changed quickly. We kept changing the herd immunity target. In fact, we won't even talk about that too much anymore. So what happened to that? There's a conspiracy behind that. A lot of people jumped to that conclusion. The politicization of vaccines is important. The political division drove this. I'm apolitical, but President Biden talked about Trump's vaccine in a bad way, but now it's in a good way. It's the same vaccines. It's politicized. That's not helpful. The mutations that we've seen in COVID-19 or SARS coronavirus 2 in particular have caused people to have doubts about its effectiveness because they see people that are fully vaccinated and boosted or double boosted still having breakthrough infections. The adverse effects are sometimes sensationalized. We've heard a lot of kind of stories that start about some effect that may be really concerning, but it turns out the N number is very small. And a lot of suspicions still exist in the pharma industry and in others who might profit. So there's a lot of ways that we have to educate and inform people to try to prevent these kinds of conspiracy theories from getting started. That's it.
Now is it working? It is. All right. Thank you, Adam. That was really fascinating. And one of the things that you brought up, I think is sort of the theme of the conference unofficially, is this idea of building trust, right? And so my next question kind of goes along with that. In your historical examples show that misinformation really erodes that trust that we need to build between the community and the scientists. And so I'm addressing this to Ian. As you know, a practicing scientist, you do a lot of community outreach. How can the scientific community participate more profoundly in legitimate discourse around debunking conspiracy theories and misinformation moving forward?
So, thank you, Lisa. So I want to start answering that question by just taking a little step back and talking about how the kind of scientific process works. I think conveying this is going to be critical to understanding how we better convey information. Both Adam and Joanne both kind of alluded to bits of this process, but essentially, you know, the trade of science is to publish papers predominantly, or to present findings in scientific meetings, and we do this by asking questions, gathering data, modeling possible outcomes, and presenting this in a way in which it could be absorbed by the scientific community. It can be read, it can be reproduced. It is done in a transparent way so that there is no room for confusion within these papers. This process is incredibly slow, and the process and during that time, there is a lot of room for conversation to happen, especially in the era of COVID, where a lot of the issues that scientists wish to address are global issues that are affecting everybody. So during that time, there is this information void that Adam alluded to. And to some extent, scientists will weigh on this in discussions with other scientists and also in discussions with the public as well. And the discussions with other scientists typically are slow. They take the form of kind of conversation through repeated papers over a number of months or years. But the conversations with the public are happening much more rapid. I wanted to highlight a particular example here of a pressing and open question that has been hotly debated in public. And this is the origins of COVID. So there is a still raging debate about whether or not there was a zoonotic crossover which originated this virus. That is, that there was some leap from an animal into a human, possibly involving a wet market in Wuhan, or whether or not there was a leak from a laboratory somewhere in the same location. Now, there is strong precedent for zoonosis. This is something that happens incredibly frequently in nature. It was the cause of Ebola outbreaks, the prior SARS outbreak, MERS, countless numbers of diseases that infect humans started as animal diseases and jumped over. And the more that we are in close proximity to animals, especially in regions that humans typically haven't inhabited before, the more likely zoonoses are going to happen. But there is also precedent for lab leaks as well. There was a notorious lab leak in 2004 in Beijing, where individuals working on SARS-CoV-1 were infected by that virus. So addressing this particular question for SARS-CoV-2 is going to take a lot of time to get to the bottom of this, and we may never have the transparency to work this out. For instance, it took something like 14 years for the origin of SARS-CoV-1 to be determined. We still do not know the original source of the 2014 Ebola outbreak. So during this process, I think it's key that scientists convey the amount of information that we do know precisely. So when Adam was talking just now, I was taking some note of some of the specific language that he was using, because it's the language that scientists use to show kind of confidence in what we're saying. So he said in the earliest known smallpox case for which we have evidence. Not saying that that was the very first smallpox case, but the first one that we have evidence for. And that's key, because that is saying that there is a margin of error, that smallpox could well have originated well before that 3,500 years ago. He also put n equals 1, which also is great scientific shorthand for saying that this study was only performed on a very small sample size. Joanne also talked about small sample sizes and the lack of distrust there. So being able to convey when we have confidence in a particular finding is absolutely critical.
And Ian, I think that brings up a really good point, in that there's almost a very distinct disconnect between the speed at which we receive information now and the speed at which we can access information. You know, as a former journalist, you're asked to write sometimes 2 to 3 stories a day. So you're just pumping out information, which is the exact opposite of what scientists are doing, right? They're taking their time, they're being exacting. And so I think those two things being in conflict with one another are, to me, it almost seems like it's going to inherently create issues and possibly be a reason for the development of this distrust. And it's only getting harder to do with social media and being able to put it out even faster. Did you have a comment, Joanne?
I think with social media, this is, sorry.
No, go ahead, Ian.
With social media, we are starting to see a lot of bad actors come into play. Not necessarily only people who are have other vested interests at mind, but also people who are kind of armchair scientists who are coming in and reanalyzing data and giving medical advice about how things should change. There are a few individuals who are notorious for doing this, some of whom have Nobel Prizes, but are not qualified to give advice about COVID epidemiology. So I think it is very difficult to determine who you should be listening to on platforms like Twitter, where there is a lot of discourse going on, and it is not often clear who the trustworthy sources are.
And if I could add to that, the advice I often give to people is ask a question of the place you're looking at for your information. Ask a question about something you know and see whether their answer resonates with you, with something you know as a fact. For us, it might be a scientific fact that I might know about my research. What will extend lifespan, because I work on aging. I know most of the things people on those sites will say are incorrect because we've studied them in the lab. But it can also go to any daily activity. If somebody says cats can be vegetarians, most of us know that's not true. And so maybe don't believe what they're saying about COVID or some other conspiracy. If they say that women can't do math, that's probably not true, right? So ask them a question, or look for an answer to one of the questions that you know for a fact the answer to. And then ask yourself about whether they are a credible site to get your information about current events. Always do that homework. Take the time to say, I know this is a fact because I live it, I experience it, I work on it. And if they're not telling you something that's truthful, then really be skeptical about what they're telling you about whatever is current and in the news.
Sorry. No, that's extremely valuable advice, and actually speaks to one of my next questions, in terms of what do you all believe is the community's role in building trust in science. So we've talked a little bit about the scientist's role, but what is the community's role? And I think definitely looking for legitimate forms of information and places that you trust is certainly a step in that direction. Adam, do you have any thoughts there?
Well, one thing I love to do personally, I don't have that much time to do it these days, but I love to go to schools, particularly when my children were in public schools, and I would contact the science teachers and ask them if I could come talk to a class to try to encourage or to light that fire under them to really have that interest in STEM. And of course, since you know my hobby now, I would talk about the influences of smallpox in particular on world cultures, but then tie that to all the various parts of STEM that are involved in studying something like this, a process like this. So tying it to some real world events and just encouraging them at a young age to study STEM. I think you would find, I have N=0 on this, but kids that would tend to focus or be interested in the STEM fields are probably less likely to just take on face value what they might hear in a social media environment. Somebody's probably studied that. There's probably 10 PhDs on that. But that makes sense. I mean, if people are thinking, using their minds, they know some chemistry, they know some biology, they know some math. If they can challenge some of those statements that are made out there, I think we'll be better for it. So our role, our responsibility, I think, is to encourage STEM at a very young age. Somebody doesn't necessarily have to finish with a STEM career, but I hope they have some STEM interest and understanding and lack of fear of STEM. Because then when they see something that comes out that has a scientific ring to it, they don't just shut it off. Some of those terms, some of those phrases sound familiar, and they have a better chance of understanding.
I would like to add to that a little bit. Within science, we have a severe problem in that there is this leaky pipeline of throughout kind of levels of education, more and more selecting just for having white men at the top levels of science as you go on. And we are not necessarily the best advocates to reach out to every single community and convey scientific trust. And making sure that everybody is making it through the scientific pipeline is critical for being able to engage every community in science.
That's an excellent point. And really, so much of this is connected, right? So we're talking about STEM education at very, very early ages, all the way through making sure that our scientists, that there is diversity and there's equity moving up through the scientific pipeline. And all of that is connected to building trust, which then allows you to communicate, which then allows someone to receive that communication much more efficiently and be able to believe it. And so with that, I want to go ahead and open it up to questions from our audience. And if there's anyone online who has questions, I will be taking those from a colleague. So I'm about to grab my phone in case there are any questions that have popped up from online. But I'll start with anyone in the audience. Are there questions? Do we have anything?
I have a question, though I haven't really formulated it very well in my head. Being from
Hold on one second. We're going to grab you a mic so that people, we're going to grab you a mic so people virtually can hear you. Sorry. Yes, I can't seem to, I don't.
Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me?
No, it's
Good morning. Okay. Ooh, now I'm more nervous. So I have a question about what have we learned, if any, in regards to the preventative methods that were practiced in underprivileged countries, underdeveloped countries such as my own Uganda and neighboring countries, and even in the West, that they did something that helped them prevent infections from spreading the COVID-19, especially since they have to go in the markets where it's so busy and they're touchy and all these other things. Because when I look at their infections compared to what happened to us here in the Western world, we were hit so much. We have more technology, we are more educated. Is it a social thing? Is it a cultural thing? Is it political? What can we learn from them to help us in case this happens again, because it will happen again. And that's not a bad omen or anything like that. Because they battled the Ebola, they've battled the Marburg diseases, and they've done something to stop or prevent so much death. And so what can we learn from that? Is there any studies that are being done?
I am going to ask the scientists first to answer that question, and then I can take a stab at it.
I don't know if I have the answer, but I think there are some really important lessons to learn. I think a lot of it may come down to culture and how people interact with each other. And it's been really surprising to me being in the US and watching how people responded to the pandemic and very quickly lost the ability to care about their neighbors and how they were doing and checking in on them. We started off really well. And then we really started thinking about ourselves more. And I think we can learn a lot from how community interacts together and takes care of their own. And really functions as a unit to fix a problem. And I think that was lost here and a little bit still lost here. And I hope that we can get some of that back. It's been surprising to me. But I don't know the answer to your question. I hope somebody's looking, because there are some really valuable lessons that we can learn.
And I would just add to that, I think from what I've seen, at least here in our community, I think it definitely goes along with Joanne's answer about culture. That is me. All right, let me try this again. So I think it goes along with that answer of culture. What we have seen is that it definitely makes a difference when the information is coming from the community and coming from a trusted member of the community. And so it's not just a matter of making sure that accurate information is being delivered through media sources, but it makes a difference if that information is being delivered by someone who really is in the community, knows the community well. And I think that's a lesson that we can definitely learn, is that there's a level of trust that needs to be built before the information can be received. And so I think that that's just done a little bit better in other countries than is done here. And so that's definitely a lesson, at least that I've taken away. And it's something that I take into account when we're trying to share information out about the research that we do, that it's not just the information being delivered, but it is who's delivering that information. Thank you for that question. Yep. Anyone else have any questions? Sorry for the feedback on this. So if no one else has any other questions, I'm going to ask a final question of all of our panelists. If you could leave us with a closing thought, one thing that you want all of us to take away, either doing or saying or being able to take back into our communities, what would that be?
I can jump in quick as I'm on delay. So I would say, I would go away, please, thinking and understanding that science is a process and it takes time, and be wary of quick and easy answers.
I guess mine would be two things. Number one is the only human disease ever eradicated. Can you guess what that is? Smallpox. I thought it was a giveaway. And how was it eradicated? Vaccines. So that's number one. But number two is that, we really have to not do things that fuel the divide between people who are concerned about vaccines for their own health and safety or for that of their children, and those of us who see what we think is the right way to do things and vaccinate people. The more divide we create, the more difficult the problem becomes. So be kind to people that may have a different perspective or a different opinion. Treat them with respect. Don't hesitate to engage in conversations, but, let's keep it civil.
So I have two take-homes. One is for me and one is for you. Speaking to our community, what I would say is follow the data. So look for the data that actually tells you that what you're believing is correct. Now that's challenging when you don't know where to get the data or you don't know how to interpret the data. So the message to myself is to be better at communicating that out to the public, to help people understand how to interpret a scientific finding. And that may mean going and doing K through 12 education. It may be talking with the media, but helping people understand how to interpret the data that scientists are generating so that you know what you should and shouldn't believe.
I'm going to take this mic to close out. I want to thank our panelists first for sharing their insights. It's been a really interesting conversation. Definitely learned a lot about smallpox. Thank you, Adam. And I will apologize to your wife for sharing that information. So again, thank you to the audience, your wonderful questions. It has really been a pleasure spending the morning with you. And with that, I will close out the session. Thank you.